So, good evening, everyone. We're going to slightly change the format of our show from what we normally do. And for those that are not aware, William is doing a master's currently with Modern Money Lab, an economics master's. I think that William has changed during the course of Scotonomics, and I think that he would refer to himself now as a degrowther. Why have you changed? And when you're talking about degrowth, what's the context that you're talking about, William?
Hello, Karen. Nice to see you. Nice to see everyone. Thanks for joining us. It was actually when I started doing my science masters, which was nearly 2 years ago now, and I went into this not having a love of capitalism, but I didn't really have any solid position on whether the economy should grow or shrink, or whose economy should grow, or what things in it should change. And then I was actually, really deeply impacted by how much we've pushed against the planetary boundaries that we have, and the graveness of the ecological challenges that we face. And this was a science master, so this was all based on this climate science. And I kind of looked at the end of that, and it just seemed like a really obvious step for me to say, it's clear that we've grown too much already. So what do we do? And then an obvious thing when you've taken that jump is to say, well, we've got to shrink what we do. We've got to pull back to somehow get behind or start living to, or starting to live within these planetary boundaries. And then when you take that step, and you've got an economics background, an interest in economics, I think that pushes you kind of naturally towards degrowth. So it was never I'm taking this master's to learn how degrowth would work or anything like that. It's just been a natural progression for me. I started this as an economist, someone who was interested in Scottish independence and the climate, but really I've arrived at degrowth, I think, after this kind of scientific analysis of the problems, and then looking at the economy. How do we change the economy to bring it back within those planetary boundaries?
And would you say that now that you're doing your master's with Modern Money Lab, that's reinforcing the masters that you did previously, the science masters?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been really really impacted by how this understanding of what a government actually does, and the importance of currency within that to actually give you the power and the ability to make changes. And this is the master's is underpinned by ecological economics, which is similar in a lot of ways to degrowth, but it's also quite different. I don't know if we'll get into the kind of depth of that tonight, but there's a difference between what ecological economists think and what a degrowth economist would think. And then the other side, it's underpinned by modern monetary theory. So it's almost, for me, that this master's is saying, these are the problems, these are the ecological problems. How do we solve that? And a deeper and better understanding of how money is created and what it can be used for, and the problems with doing it from the way that it's done in the mainstream at the moment really affects that.
I am interested, and we will try and find the time to do this, to understand what an ecological economist and a degrowth economist, how they think differently. So can you explain that?
Well, we've actually got someone coming on the show in a couple of weeks who's an ecological economist, and we can maybe cover that. I think at the end, but they've been doing that. I think that'd be a really good question to ask them. What's the difference? But you started just by saying about the context, and this is why I wanted to do a show on degrowth, because we never have the opportunity to discuss degrowth within context. Understandably, we've already got a couple of questions coming in. It's kind of like, why should we degrow? Who degrows? And I think instantly when you say the word degrowth, that's where people end up. And a lot of people say it's such a terrible name. What does it mean? So for me, the context is really important. And that's kind of what I wanted to start with. So if it's okay with you, I think it's really important to look at what's happened in the last 50 years. And the last 50 years, from like 1970, has been an absolutely exceptional 50 years on the planet. It's never happened before by kind of any extent on what's happened with the impact of humans on the climate. And I don't think it can really ever happen again this 50 years, because of so damaging. And that's where I'd like to start with the context. It's just realizing that the 50 years that we've all lived under is so different from anything else that's happened before. I think that's quite important. The
Yeah,
second,
I was
yeah,
going to say that's labelled as moving from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, where
absolutely.
so we're moving from a phase where humans didn't rather affect our climate to a phase now where we are very actively affecting our climate.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next thing is to start thinking about growth as a flow. And this is something that a lot of people don't think about. Growth is just simply a flow of things that come into the stock. And the wealth that we hold already, that's the stock. That's the stock of wealth. And it gets bigger, that stock, when there's flows of growth. And I think too often, we've said this a few times on the show, too often we concentrate on the flows and we never really think about the stock. And I want people to think, kind of look out their window and look at everything around them and think, actually, do we have enough? Let's look at how wealthy our society is in a whole, not you or your neighbors or your town, but as a country as a whole, and think, actually, if we look at this as a stock of wealth, this has been building up for centuries. There's only 5 million of us. Do we really have enough of this stock? Do we have to keep continually adding to it by growing our economy every single year? And I genuinely think, and I'd love people to mention in the comments, have you ever really thought about the economy like that? When you read GDP figures and growth, do you realize that this is just a tiny, tiny bit that's been added to our immense kind of amount of stuff? And I think with that context, degrowth seems, not adding to that stock rather than shrinking it, not adding to it, seems, I think, a little bit more appealing. So
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, William, I have always thought that way, and I think that came from various different things. I remember when I was in my early 20s reading some literature by Native Americans as well. That made me think much more deeply about our environment as well. But then actually, there's a couple of things culturally I think that are quite important to me too, and maybe other people recognise this as well. In 1996, Train Spotting came out. And a few years later, in 1999, there was another film came out, Fight Club, and they were both very much about minimalism and our consumption and what it was doing to us psychologically. And I think for me, again, I'd be in my mid-20s by then. I really started to think, what are we doing, and what's this all about? And really worrying about it then, and also being aware of that again, like I say, that culture from Native Americans, and then relating that to that and thinking, yeah, this is really problematic what's happening here in Western culture.
this is this idea of sufficiency, isn't it? It's looking out and thinking, actually, if we share this, if we use this a lot better, we've probably got enough. Do we really need new stuff? Jane Jones has just asked me to explain that stock again. So what you've got really, when you're looking at an economy, or even your savings, Jane, or how much you earn, your savings is your stock. And that's increased or decreased by how much you earn. So if you earn more than you need to spend, and you put some of that into savings, that's you building up a stock. And over a period of time, you hope that stock gets bigger. But if you go on holiday, that stock comes down. But when we talk about a lot of concepts in economics, we've just really talk about the flow, the little bit. How much do you earn? Rather than how much wealth do you have. That's a much more fundamental question. And when we're talking about the size of the economy, we always focus on, did it grow last year? No one ever says, well, actually, what's the stock? How big is our economy at the moment? And if you ask that question, I think it becomes a lot easier to say, well, if our economy is worth, 250 trillion, does it really need an extra 550 billion this year? Does that really make much of a difference? So this is why I think stocks and flows are really, really important. The other question I've got, the context is, this is, I think, where it becomes a wee bit more controversial. And if you're looking at stock of wealth and you ask yourself, well, where does that wealth actually come from? What creates that wealth? Where did it come from? And as someone who's now a degrowther with an ecological economics training, you're kind of looking at it and you're thinking, well, you need resources, and those resources come first. So you really have to ask yourself, where did all these resources come from that Scotland, the United Kingdom, turned into wealth? And we're a tiny little island which is incredibly wealthy. And most of those resources came from the global south. Now, and most of them, if not all of them, were stolen or appropriated by the British Empire, and we have gained a huge amount from that. And again, talking as a country, not as individuals, not as families, but as a country. And before you can have wealth, you need resources. And I was just looking for some kind of figures, and there's an economist, Utsa Patanik, calculated the value of resources taken from India by the British in less than 2 centuries at a mind-boggling 45 trillion. So $45 trillion of wealth from India to the UK. And that's where our wealth comes from. And I know you've said it before, Karen, but it's kind of like the sugar that powered all the workers in Angus wasn't grown, wasn't grown up the road. There was no cotton in Lancaster. These were all taken from the global south. So again, I think this context makes us look at where we are now in our growth really differently. And then the final thing to say about where wealth comes from is energy. We need the energy to turn our resources into wealth. And that didn't really happen until we started eating into the non-renewable resources that we have on the planet. And so that's kind of the context. But I've got this wonderful couple of charts to show you. And again, to kind of push on this idea. Let's see if I can get these up. Okay, right. Can you see that there? This is the global direct primary energy consumption from the 1910s going upwards. So you see it starts at just under 20,000 terawatt hours. Okay, so that is energy consumption. This is global, well, this is world GDP since the same time.
Yeah. So it's mirroring that. Yeah.
And here are the two of them together.
Yeah.
So you can argue that, normally white white-haired bespectacled men in the 1800s came up with all this huge genius. All of a sudden this eruption of genius happened in the 1800s, and we had all of this wonderful wealth creation. Or you can look at this and say we were able to get 20,000 hours of human labor out of a barrel of oil, and with that we were able to make stuff. And up until the start of the middle of the 1800s and into the late 1800s, but not until 1970 was everyone doing that. And that's where our global wealth came from. And, this is an assumption that a degrowther would make and say, actually, our wealth isn't from technological advances or fantastically, creative, innovative people. That adds a little bit to it, takes a little bit. Maybe it makes life easy, but in terms of the wealth, it's almost one-to-one. And again, I think that's something that probably most people haven't thought about, especially these wealth creators, these billionaires who think that it's them that creates all the wealth. The relationship between resources and energy is really, really tight. So that's the kind of context that very often we don't get to put to anyone when we're starting to talk about degrowth.
Yeah, and I think also as well, I certainly see over my lifetime as well, there's a growing awareness, and I think the internet, which really only came into being when I was 30. So, it's really exposing really absurd levels of wealth. And I think a lot of people are kicking back on that. And I think a lot of young people especially are as well, because it's their future that's being stolen by absurd accumulation on the part of the 1%. And that's really got to stop. And I think, to be fair, there's quite a lot of wealthy people in the UK that are actually literally begging the UK government to tax them more, because they understand that this inequality that's being created is actually quite dangerous for them as well. Yeah. Because you look at some South American countries where people with wealth wouldn't dare to go because they would be kidnapped. And I think quite a lot of wealthy people are starting to see that, your world would become a dangerous place if you make it too unequal. And that really concerns me as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the last bit of context really is something that I think is really important, and that is that we too often too many people use growth as a shortcut for well-being.
Mhm.
And as a society, this has kind of become like a root metaphor for us. When people speak about growth, we think about that being our well-being. And it's really, really difficult to actually break those two things up and say, yeah, they are related, but it's not maybe the relationship that you think. So this is this idea that, when we grow, it raises all of our boats. And I've got a little clip from one of our
Raises
speakers.
all yachts, William. Raises all
Yeah,
yachts.
it doesn't. So I've got a clip from Timothy, who spoke for us at the Festival of Economics, and he kind of covers this, and he just says this idea, if at the moment, if everything's growing, it's clear that not everyone is doing well, and he flips that round, and I think this is really interesting. So let me see what you think.
We understand that when an economy grows, it does not mean that everyone's income is rising. We know, that trickle-down economics is a completely flawed theory. So think about the same thing in reverse. You can shrink national income while maintaining or even increasing income for the bottom poorest half of the population. So there's nothing automatic. There's something automatic within capitalism about recession hitting the poor first. But if we plan for it, there is nothing on paper that prevents us from designing that temporary degrowth transition so that it actually makes those that are worse off today better off.
So I think
Yeah,
we're really
I think that,
Timothy
yeah.
speaking at our event, and I think that's a really, really important point.
Yeah, I think the other thing as well, and I picked this up when I listened to Donut Economics. Kate Raworth makes the point that we stop growing after a certain amount of time. Once we're a certain height and our hands are big enough and our feet are big enough, then it's enough, and we can get on and crack on with our lives. And I think also as well, the language around growth is portrayed as being very positive. So it's that upward trajectory or that forward trajectory. Whereas, being still is seen as something that's maybe a negative, and I think that adherence to that language and really, seeing that as a positive is something that we have to roll back from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got another clip of Timothy kind of covering that narrative of growth. So I'll play this. This one's a little bit longer, a couple of minutes.
There's one narrative that is very strong nowadays, and that is the one of economic growth. So regardless whether you are a country, so-called a developing country, a poor country, or whether you are a very high-income country, the goal of economic organization should be to foster economic growth. Which economic growth in economics is not like innovation or progress or anything like we usually associate in our unconsciously with the term. It is something very specific. It is GDP points. And GDP is an indicator of monetary agitation. And so as we try to foster economic growth or just maintain or protect from anything that could slow down economic growth, I think we are putting social issues and ecological issues as second priority to that democratically planned downscaling of production and consumption in rich countries in order to lighten ecological footprints while decreasing inequality and improving well-being. It's also a paradigm to criticize the hegemony of growth in governance in general, let it be at the level of government. We've talked a bit about it, the power of GDP and the importance of replacing growth by well-being mindset, but also at the level of companies. So changing indicators of success, and also with that, not only changing the software, but also the hardware of economic organization. And I'll stop here showing that if you just pull on the thread, starting from that, if you really what you want to do is to organize and achieve this shrinkage that is both just and convivial and democratic, that means nothing less than a dismantlement of capitalism as we know it.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. Yeah. Now, so what is degrowth? How do you see it? How do you see it?
I think kind of Timothy touched on that, and I think that it's such a simple concept. It's just I think it's handicapped by the name of degrowth. I think it's really difficult to get that over. There's a lot of hurdles to get over before people understand it. But it really is a shrinking, a lowering of consumption in the wealthiest parts of the world to allow space for the poorer people within countries and the poorer countries to expand, but all with a kind of clear idea of what well-being actually means. And I think you'll find like everyone will kind of everyone who's in degrowth will discuss it or define it differently. Timothy there, mine's is probably different. I think this is a really good one from Rachel, who chaired our session on the Sunday. Rachel's a climate investigator, and she'd probably loosely call herself a degrowth, but looking back at the session, I thought this was a wonderful definition. Let me know what you think here.
Well, there's a huge difference between degrowth and a recession, because a recession is what happens when an economy is mismanaged by, an idiotic government, which we know very well. Degrowth is when governments take into consideration our planetary boundaries, our well-being, and our societies, and orchestrate and engineer a way for people to live better together.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can argue with that.
yeah. I guess what I would probably say is the language of degrowth is quite frightening for some people. I think immediately I phoned up Radio Scotland a few years ago about this, because literally people are thinking of hair shirts when you start saying degrowth. And I think maybe the language around it has to be more careful to begin with. And that's maybe to talk about a mature, thriving economy rather than degrowthing, because, we are, for all intents and purposes. But again, as Kate Raworth says, it's thinking about planning and redistribution. And that's what we really want to do. And, to be fair to the Scottish Government, they do have better tax policies that are more distributive. So, yeah, I could see that we could do a lot more once we become a currency issuer.
Yeah. I think definitely. I think there's issues with that, and as Timothy said there, that degrowth has kind of deliberately been chosen as a way to try and shift the paradigm, is to say the growth is not necessarily good. It causes as much problems as you think it's solving. And the American ecological economist Herman Daly, he spoke about economic growth and uneconomic growth. And he was all in favour of economic growth, in the sense that growth is fine if it increases people's well-being. That's good growth. But what we've got, and he reckoned in most countries in the global north, we had uneconomic growth. And I know we've spoken at length about things like the Piper Alpha disaster and all of these types of things, but it's difficult to think that the Piper Alpha disaster would have raised the British GDP by billions. But the huge ecological and psychological and physical and emotional pain that had isn't taken into account at all. That's uneconomic growth. Externalities, not economic. Externalities is one of those words. Of course, it's not an externality. It's just what's classed in the neoclassical frame. Yeah. So there's quite a few different ways, but I think it is all about focusing on well-being. And I'm just going to, there's a question here. I just want to mention well-being, because we had Lucas Bunce from the We All Alliance, and we asked him a question about degrowth and the well-being at the event. But just see, there's a couple of questions here. Would you agree that wealth accumulated through growth should pay for times of degrowth? Well, I think that's at the heart of it, Ashbury. We need to look at our stock of wealth, and we need to realise that actually this at the moment, to not so directly answer your question, the wealth that we've got, we're eating into a lot of that. We're treating a lot of it as renewable when it isn't renewable. And if we just keep eating into that stock of wealth when we're not growing, then the economy is not sustainable. The economy has to be in a position where you're providing enough for everyone every year without eating into the stock that you've already built up. So, an easy answer would be saying, yeah, of course, you just put all that aside, and when the economy is not doing particularly well, you pull out of it. But that's not how it works. It's really trying to move the economy to much more of a steady state economy where you're running sustainably, so that, you don't need to dig into it and add to it. It's just always managed so there's enough for everyone, and it's much more equally redistributed. But there's nothing wrong with that framing. I'll just look at the UBI. would a UBI assist in this endeavour? Also interested in UBI as a way forward. Interestingly, UBI is not a policy which is particularly well supported in the degrowth movement, and it's also, coincidentally, not particularly well supported within the modern money theory paper and literature as well. I think it's definitely something we need to look at. It moves us away from poor people having more money, which is what we need to do. But I think there's other ways to do that. And a degrowth policy, a much stronger policy, because I'm going to go on to policies, is an employer of last resort, basically a job guarantee scheme and universal basic services, rather than giving people more money. And this kind of moves us away from an economy that's focused on money. And I think that's one of the problems for me with, or not problems, but one of the issues with UBI is it still very much seems to be in this growth paradigm, this if only you had enough money, rather than saying to people, money's not the thing. It's the type of society you have and what you do with that money. Kieran, I know you've got some thoughts on a job guarantee. Before we go back to that well-being thing, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, again, in the 1970s, the promise was that the machines would do the work and we would have more leisure time. And artificial intelligence is also promising that as well. I saw an article recently about how it would replace a lot of lawyers. I think that has to be embraced, and the creation of things that perhaps we don't need. And the other thing is, yes, societies focus so much on money, and that we shared a clip actually in SCOTONOMICS, and actually on my page as well, where there was a guy just basically saying, and I can't remember which organization he came from, that the workers were just getting it too easy and they basically needed a kick up the backside to make them work harder. And, I put it up and just said, yeah, but the machines are supposed to be doing the work. That was the plan 50 years ago when I was a child. So what's happened to that plan? Yeah. And why isn't humanity enjoying more leisure and stopping doing pointless tasks that don't really need to happen? And I think David Graeber wrote a book about this a few years ago called, it was about pointless work that happened. Yeah.
And jobs or something it was called, rubbish jobs or
bullshit jobs. Bullshit jobs. And he made some really interesting examples in that book as well, where people weren't happy, they were well paid, but they felt what they did was pointless and they weren't fulfilled by that. And when we're in a society that's like that, it is no wonder we have a pandemic of mental health problems. So we have to deal with that as a society, and certainly overt materialism is not making people happy on the whole, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of idea of a UBI, which is just, as I said, I think it's definitely got a place because it's a great way to stop people being poor, is to give them more money to be able to buy the things that they need. But just, I don't think that's the kind of long-term solution when we compare it to universal basic services, not needing the money in the first place and having a job guarantee, which is a job that you want, that's meaningful, which is very different from a huge amount of jobs in our society at the moment. I think the kind of technological point's really interesting one as well. I did want to cover this difference between a degrowth economy and a well-being economy, because I think a lot of people are probably saying this sounds quite familiar, and I think there's a fundamental difference, which maybe we'll touch on again at the end. But I thought it was quite interesting because we asked Lucas Bunce from We All Alliance, what's the difference between well-being economy and a degrowth economy? So here's a little clip. Drop me your thoughts on this. Let me know what you think.
So for us, we see a well-being economy as really the emphasis that it's an economy that is designed with the purpose of providing good lives for everyone on a healthy planet or within planetary boundaries. It's really about looking at embedding that different kind of purpose in the economy. So I'm maybe not the best person to answer that question because I also got a research background in post-growth and degrowth. So for me, they're very similar because basically, as Tim said, degrowth is about downscaling the production and consumption to the point where we are within planetary boundaries, which we would have to do for a well-being economy in a way that is equitable and that also increases well-being.
So there's a lot of similarities that that Lucas picked up on.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes complete sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I see the difference, and Lucas said he's got a background in post-growth and degrowth, but if you look at other people within the well-being economy movement, it's still very much placed within this growth paradigm and this kind of let's take the best of capitalism, and just kind of soften it and making it work for us. Whereas degrowth is very much saying this is a post-capitalist move for our economy. Our economy moves over decades from a capitalist economy to something very different. And that's not so clear within that kind of well-being literature and the well-being groups. And also degrowth is fundamentally at its heart globally looking at a global perspective and saying this global south has to have much more wealth and to bring them close to the standard of living that we have. And in most well-being literature, you don't see that. It still talks very much about our economy and making it work for our citizens. So those are two big differences, I think. And again, that's why I would say I'm much more at degrowth than I am at well-being economy. But certainly people will be able to see the similarity in some of the policies, which I'm going to cover before we disappear.
Yeah, I just feel very strongly that the over collection of resources to a few people is a madness, and it has to be stopped. And this is really what governments need to be busy with. But unfortunately, you'll have maybe heard the headlines, William, in Spain, that Rishi Sunak is pulling back on environmental progression. And there's a Conservative in the Scottish Parliament, Maurice Golden, who rejects that ultimately. So there are lots of Conservatives that are quite serious environmentalists, and this doesn't sit well with them.
Yeah, and I think I'm pretty sure you know about that Teal party that was in the Australian election last year, and they were disgruntled Conservatives who were really annoyed at the Prime Minister, who was the incumbent at the moment, throwing out all these net zero, and they just said we cannot avoid this, and they won. I think they won something like 15-20 seats, and basically they stopped another Conservative government taking place, and it's a Labour government now in Australia. So that movement is universal. There are people on the right who can see, they're not blind, they can see these huge problems, and I don't think, heaven forbid we want to give anyone advice to get a Conservative government in again, but I don't think they're going down the right track with that. And I'm going to cover that as well, actually. But when you were talking about the immense wealth, I found another stat, and it says globally the world's top 1% emit 1,000 times the amount of carbon as the world's poorest 1%. So I'll read that again. 1,000 times more carbon is emitted by the wealthiest and the poorest globally. And that for me, that's what it's about. It's about degrowing. It's about shrinking the consumption and the types of consumption of that part of the population to allow other parts of the population to start having a much more meaningful life, but all kind of encompassed within this idea that we have got boundaries. And when we're talking about degrowth, it's not like a set boundary. Over a period of time, things will be able to move. It's always within this steady state. When we can grow a little bit, we can shrink a little bit, but it's all about making sure the resources that we use are used in a sustainable way, and we're staying within those boundaries. So I kind of wanted to get on some policies. I think I listed 25, and I thought I can't do all 25, so I'm just going to choose the top 10, and I'm just going to pull them up. And if anyone's got any comments, then that'd be great. But what I really wanted to do was to give people an idea of the types of policies if we were to drop Scottish Government as an independent country, because the chances of that happening as part of the United Kingdom is as close to zero as you could possibly find. What would an independent Scotland that was following degrowth policies look like? So I've got some of these. And the first thing I wanted to say was that I was not surprised, because I saw what Rishi Sunak was doing. And this was just basically saying net zero means that you, Kieran, specifically, right, you're going to have 7 bins. You're going to have to stop flying. You're going to, this, you can see this messaging. This was completely incongruous to what a transformation of an economy would be. And this is where you know that someone's not being serious, when they're taking this kind of attack dog mentality. the 10 policies I'm going to give you, none of them are made by individuals. I've actually got 25. None of them are made by individuals because the impact takes place at a state level, which you wouldn't really notice initially, and at businesses and industry, which you wouldn't notice. No degrowth policy has at the top of it, stop eating meat or have 7 bins. It's just complete nonsense. This is just done to scare you. To move to net zero, to do any type of transformation in an economy, which is much more ecologically sound, the changes take place at state level and in businesses. And then that creates a space for individuals to actually start doing this voluntarily. And then it comes to some point and you start with the 1% where you're saying, we're banning things. You cannot have a super yacht. You cannot fly. But this is very much down the line. And I think it's much less scary when you take that really different approach that obviously Rishi Sunak and all that kind of ecological attack dog approach that I've seen, unfortunately, whilst being here.
Can I just put a little plug in for the Trawl podcast? That's TRAWL. They're 2 very funny women who run that podcast, and there were some great quotes about the 7 bins, the 7 deadly bins. So if you want to make fun of that, you can find some fun with that particular quote in that podcast. It's very good.
Well, great. Well, I'm going to put maybe 25, 30 policies up on the SCOTONOMICS blog page, so people can get a wee bit more of a picture. But I said I just wanted to go very briefly through the 10 of these here. I'm going to show each of them on screen, and I'd like you to know if you're surprised in the comments. If you're surprised by that, just put number surprise or number yes or number no. It'd be great to get a little bit of feedback on what you think. But I think some of these are really going to surprise people. And I wanted to say that this is pretty consistent, all of these policies in the degrowth literature. I've thrown in a few of my ideas, which I think fits within the framework, but most degrowthers would say that these policies are in the kind of ballpark of what a government or what an economy or what a society should be doing. So here's number 1. A less powerful and more democratic central bank. Maybe not something you would think of when you're thinking about degrowth, but these policies have a huge impact on how the economies run, and we could spend a whole episode talking about that. So when we're talking about degrowth, we're looking at institutions of the government and the state and thinking, how can they be run differently to improve well-being? Will you see any of this? Is it affecting you directly? No, hardly like any of these ones are. Let's see.
Yeah, I like that. I told you that I'm reading Paul Tucker's book just now, and it really talks about the central bank being the move from the central bank to becoming the overmighty citizen. So
no markets for natural resources. So no carbon markets, no carbon credits, nothing like that in Scotland. And in the next 10 years, if we don't do that, we're going to see companies giving things like biodiversity credits and water credits and clean air credits. And this is just a way to financialize everything, the most important parts of our economy. In a degrowth economy, this would not happen. Resources would be managed differently, and the financial resources would be found to manage the resources effectively and justly, rather than this idea of it just happening in an efficient manner. Okay, so this, I suppose, builds on to that. But again, Kieran, you and I are just old enough to remember the explosion of credit in the 80s. And I'm sure some of our audience are. It used to be really difficult to get a mortgage, and it used to be really difficult to buy things. You had to do this horrible thing called saving for it. And in a degrowth economy...
Well, it was even harder when you were a woman.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we would be looking at that as degrowth and saying, right, how can we get back to something which seems much more balanced? But also, who is it do you get credit from? If you get credit and you have to pay interest back, should that be coming back to someone who's already got loads of money? Should it be going to a private bank, or actually should it be going back to the state so that money could just disappear, creating space for other funding? So there's a huge and different way to look at finance in a degrowth economy. This is where we become much more global in perspective, and we would actually be looking at where we're doing our resources as a nation, where we're getting our resources from. And this kind of neo-colonial extractivism is really at the heart degrowth. And again, we wouldn't notice anything like this, but we would be asking our companies or telling our companies in the state to make sure that they were extracting resources in a much more manageable, fair, paying the going rate for them. So that's a big change to how an economy runs from it is at the moment. Here's another one. An increase in support for the Global South with materials and expertise being donated or exchanged. We've spoken about this quite a few times on the show, haven't we, Kieran? We bring in all of these people from the Global South to work in our National Health Service, rather than thinking, actually, why don't we train people here and send them off to these Global South and help build up their economy and help provide for services for their populations? And I think a big part of this is also saying, because of the huge problems happening in the Global South, Scotland is much more open to immigration. So
we've kind of inadvertently done that, actually, William, except the Global South that our medics are moving to is Australia.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the global. Yeah, that's the geographical Global South, but one of the richer nations. Okay, so we've got a question mark from Hashbury and 1, yes, and 2, 3, not too sure, 4, not too sure. Okay, thanks very much for the feedback. Yeah, we won't go into the detail in this, but it really is, our central bank is designed in such a way that you could look at it and you could say the whole infrastructure is designed to help the already wealthy in society. And you can manage an economy with a central bank doing something very different, and that would have a huge impact on economy. Maybe we'll do an episode on that one for you, Hashbury. Okay, number 6, the use of empowered citizen assemblies to drive change.
Yeah, I am all for much more democracy, but it does cost money, and to run these things and make them happen. In fact, in Aberdeen City Council, we want to have an assembly, but it's an expensive thing, and when your money's tight, there's a lot of pushback against it as well.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. But that's another thing that I maybe didn't say was the difference between Wellbeing economy and a degrowth economy is this democracy. Yeah. And citizen assemblies are already proving across the globe how useful they are and how effective they are and how fair they are. So that would certainly be something that we'd look to roll out. Another one, a significant refocusing of corporate governance and a move away from shareholder primacy.
Mm-hmm.
Again,
absolutely.
Something you would expect to be talking about in terms of bins and meat consumption and flights and it's compulsory car sharing. It's all just nonsense. These are the types of things that make a transformative difference when we're looking at how to restructure economy. So the next one is we actually, I'll say this. So this is a restructuring of the advertising, marketing, and PR industries to reduce their influence. And we asked Timothy Parkey at the conference about policies, and this is his number 1. He just thinks that there's huge issues and that we've got these industries who are creating wants. And J.K. Galbraith, who was writing in the 50s, he was really seeing the explosion of the advertising agency in the industry. And he was saying, no one's calling for these products. No one wants them. These companies are not reacting to the demands of the consumer. These demands are being created by the companies through advertising and marketing, and then they're providing them. So I'm a really strong believer in that as well. So I think in a type of an economy, a degrowth economy, these are the types of things we'd be looking to do. How we would do that and how we would do all of these policies, that's what we need to get to discuss. But this is the type of thing that we'd be doing. I don't think many people would have an issue with reducing the power of advertising, marketing, and PR.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, they understand that they're being manipulated by advertising. And again, I'll refer back to Fight Club in 1999 when, one of the characters, Tyler Durden, said, advertising Scotland getting us buying shit we don't need to impress people we don't care about. So, really, I think if you're thinking about your life and what you're doing with it, that really is a very obvious thing that you don't want to be manipulated by.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's really important to focus on that. If you were trying to reduce the consumption, is firstly getting rid of all the stuff that literally no one wants. They're just being sold to. A greater reliance on the use of fiscal rather than monetary policy. Again, this points much more towards the government having more control of the social surplus and looking at this massive amount of financial wealth and saying, right, what we need to do with this is we need to target particular parts of the economy, and we have to do, we have to build things, we have to make sure that these people are looked after. And you do that with fiscal policy. You don't do that with monetary policy, which is effectively raising the interest rates ups and downs. And I'm sure some of our regular viewers will know that's how the economy is managed at the moment, through monetary policies, and it's monetary dominance is what we have in all of the Western democracies at the moment. And degrowth would be saying the government has to play much more of a role in our economy, and we do that by the government spending the money that it creates rather than trying to manage the economy through interest rates. And then the last one I've got on my list, I could easily have gone through the 30 of them. I'm glad I'm stopping now. The last one was public ownership of utilities. And I've definitely put public ownership deliberately, because it's not about nationalisation. And I think if we see utilities as either being private or nationalised, I think we miss all of the great things in between, which is community ownership. And it might be that some ownership of utilities is nationalised first, but it's all about ownership. And a degrowth model wants to see ownership within the community and held by people who are close to where those services and those products are provided. So this idea of community wealth building would find a home in a degrowth economy. So I'll post the rest of these policies on our blog, and that'll be up either tomorrow or Wednesday. What's your thoughts, Karen, of those kind of 10? Are those the types of policies you thought we'd be talking about when we're talking about degrowth?
Oh, I think they're all pretty sensible. And yeah, absolutely. It's really, again, it's about redistribution, isn't it? And again, it's thinking about the economy as a system, which also Kate Raworth talks about as well. But also, when you've done a science degree or engineering, you do think that way anyway. So where's the start point? What happens? Where's the end? How is it all working? What's it affecting? And I think that a lot more economists need to be thinking that way. I mean, certainly William Nordhaus, who thinks that we can survive with 6 degrees of warming. So yeah, we've got to really reject these people.
Well, have a look here, and you'll see we've got quite a lot of people are saying yes, definitely, yeah. But before, we've still got about 10 minutes left, so if there was anyone who's watching, if you want me to kind of discuss any of them again, then please just drop it in. But overall, I'd like to hear from the people who are watching. Is this the type of policies you thought we would be talking about when we're talking about degrowth? Because maybe that's what people are expecting, but certainly from my conversations, driven by this narrative that we see in Westminster, is very much about this: what am I expected to do right now, and why am I being targeted? So that would be quite interesting. But yeah, none of those policies were for individuals. And I would say maybe as I got onto my kind of 25 or 30, you start seeing ones creeping in that are targeting the wealthiest in society. That's where it starts. State industries, the wealthiest in society. And then after, let's say X amount of years, we start looking at, if we haven't made a big enough impact on our planetary boundaries, then we all have to start directly doing things to help. But, we're just individuals. We buy what's consumed. If these companies are making things differently and we're consuming them in a much more ecologically friendly way, then we're doing our part. We don't really need to be doing anything until the state and these industries are doing it all first. Okay, so Jane Jones, it makes complete sense apart from UBI. Jane, I think you mean that you're in favour of UBI, if you just want to let me know. And as I said there, I think UBI will probably be something that we try. I hope it's something we try in an independent Scotland, because it might work in certain circumstances. But to move to a degrowth world when we're focusing less on material wealth, we should be thinking more about the universal basic services. So Jane, just say, if you had the money and you went out and you spent it in the society, that would be great if you don't have much financial wealth at the moment. But what we'd be seeing is so many of the things that you should be spending your money on should be free. So you don't need a universal basic wage when you go out and transport's free and the gym's free and there's great playgrounds and the library's free and there's a free cinema and there's meeting places and there's festivals, all these things, you're thinking, well, what do I spend my money on now? And that's how we move away from this kind of financialization, always concentrating on money. And I'm not saying in any way in a degrowth economy money wouldn't be important. It's fundamentally important, but it's trying to dematerialize. And we think we do that by saying to people, here's a good job that you earn money from, a job that keeps you happy, it keeps everyone employed, rather than saying here's an amount of money that kind of just adds to the stock of financial wealth, which is still, still ends up a majority of it, or a high percentage of it, with the people who are already wealthy. So it's just a very different way of looking. But so I hope that's helpful. And Hashpray said he's leaning in that direction too. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, you know that I'm not a fan of UBI. I used to be a fan of it, but yeah, everyone has to be putting their shoulders to the wheel in some sort of way in an independent Scotland. And I did meet someone on a march recently, and they were retired, and I said, when we're independent, you might have to come out of retirement and do some things that are required for your country to thrive. So we have an elderly population. They need care. So we're either going to pay people to do it for us, or we're going to be looking after those elderly relatives of our own ourselves. So there's an awful lot of work out there that needs to be done. There's a lot of people with mental health problems caused by the way that our economy works, I would argue. So there's a lot of people need to be helped in that way, young adults as well. So there's the point I'm trying to make is there's an awful lot of work to do in our society, but they're not there's a lot of things that we don't need to do anymore that the machines do now, and that's a good thing. But there are other things that we do need to do as a society to look after each other.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that again, we've had Jane come back. I think you're quite a strong supporter of UBI, Jane, and I think it's really difficult. And I've been wanting to do an episode on this for a while, actually, to get someone to come on and not argue against, because I think a lot of people have got a similar, where we would like to see a job guarantee and a universal basic income, what we want it to do and where do we want it to take people. I agree completely. But when we're speaking about a job guarantee scheme, that also kind of automatically includes payment for people who can't work. So at no point is a job guarantee scheme saying that everyone has to work, and that you can take a job or you cannot take a job. So it's almost that the UBI is kind of built into there. So it's not, to re-emphasize it, it's not saying, Jane, you're fine, get a job. You're not getting any money unless you get a job. That's not a job guarantee scheme. A job guarantee scheme is saying there's a job that's available for you that you want, that pays well. But if you don't want that, you'll still be supported by society with some kind of income that makes you comfortable, but you will also have access to all these universal basic services, which mean you're much more likely to have a better well-being because you're not worrying about all these other things. So it's probably part, I think Rachel's just said, still the value in a small amount of UBI on top of comprehensive universal basic services. Absolutely. I think these all things that they're so close to each other.
No, I'm going to kick back on this. No, absolutely. So I think when people want UBI, what they want is a fairer society, and they want a quick fix to get there. And the amount of money you get is not going to make society fairer. It would be, again, you would have to design it differently for different places. So Edinburgh and Arbroath, for example, a small village in comparison to a city, and etc. So what I think people who are interested in UBI, what they want are fairer social security when you come upon hard times. We should absolutely have that. Of course we should. But we should encourage those who can work to work. Work is rewarding. But, if you can't work, you should absolutely be supported.
Okay. Jane, again, just to clarify, you said yes, but many people would care for vulnerable with a UBI. True. But we would also, that would be part to do that. Yeah, that would be part of the job guarantee scheme. Yeah. So if you wanted to be paid to look after that would be part. One of the big things within a degrowth economy is this idea of care and a caring economy, and the care is something that kind of explodes or greatly expands in an economy, and that's the type of thing that we would say completely, Jane, is that the job would be, you would have a job rather than this payment for that. You've said, Guy,
this is work that should be properly valued, and in our current situation it's not properly valued. And again, I would say in an independent Scotland, when we become a currency issuer, we can make that work properly valued, and we need to.
Yeah. Well, Jane, if you wouldn't mind just dropping in a link there. You've said read Guy Standing. If you don't mind just taking a few seconds and sticking it on, that would be great for people who are watching. I think it'd be worth us doing this, and I would hate this kind of conversation to derail what was spoken about in degrowth, because I'm sure, as Karen said there, what we all want is a much more fairer society, a society which is within its planetary boundaries. I don't think, as you know, as a trainee economist at the moment, that I could say UBI is a terrible idea and we shouldn't do it. I don't think there's enough evidence for that. I don't think there's enough evidence to say that we do job guarantee. Exactly. But I think you have to test these things, you know, and I think we need to have pilots and we need to test these things to see in what circumstance they work. Because what I'm completely against is this idea that one policy does work everywhere and one policy doesn't. So I think there's much more nuance when we're talking about does a UBI or a job guarantee scheme. And I think when we're spoken about, you can see there's a lot of things that are similar. But as I said, let's not derail that. Let's have an episode on UBI versus a job guarantee scheme and universal basic services, because I think there's a lot there. But what I wanted to do, and thanks very much for joining us, was just to get across that even though it's a really simple idea, that a global society, we must pursue policies to reduce material consumption and increase our well-being. That's degrowth. Within that, there's a huge amount of policies and impact and paradigm change and effect. You know, it's a very small sentence, but actually it's a completely new way of running our economy. And I think that's what most people would agree with when we're looking at where we are in Scotland. And I think degrowth is certainly one of the ways that we would get there. Thank you, Jane. I think we'll definitely see we've got some disagreement. I'd love you to join us for our UBI degrowth, UBI job guarantee episode, which we'll try and do that before Christmas. We've got loads coming up over the next couple of weeks. Actually, we've got an interview with an ecological economist. We've got an interview with Timothy. Forgotten his second name, who wrote this wonderful book called Carbon Democracy, which is absolutely fantastic. We've also got a more in-depth interview with someone who's going to talk about degrowth and modern monetary theory. So we've got lots going on before the end of the year as we build up to our Festival of Economics, of course, which is March next year. Any final comments, Karen? Anyone want to say anything before we disappear for the evening?
I should also just mention that I'm hoping to get Jim Cuthbert on the show soon as well.
And what's he going to be speaking about?
So he's been an economist for the Scottish Government, and he's writing a paper currently for Commonweal. So once he's got the paper published, I hope to get him on too.
Great. Yes. And any ideas for things to do on the show, please do let us know, because I think this was episode 82.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We've got an article in tomorrow's National, which is probably going to list a lot more of the policies and give a little bit more of the background to degrowth. So I hope you can read that. We'll be with you in a couple of weeks' time. Until then, I hope you're well and see you again soon.
Thank you.